Well, welcome random viewer who stopped by our channel for the latest news, for the news that concerns us. And this week, I've picked out two interesting news stories. Actually, not even news, but discussions. And one of them is, what do you think? It's the frozen Russian money. Money, cash. So here's the thing. About $300 billion of Russian assets are currently frozen. And around 140 billion euros are held in the Euroclear depository. And that's what the current struggle is about. I'll probably voice an unpopular opinion, but it would be better if they didn't touch that money. Yesterday, EU officials were discussing the issue of expropriating sovereign assets. And it doesn't matter whether those assets belong to Russia or not. Objectively, they are sovereign assets. And if they had taken them, even though I'm in Ukraine and I support punishing Russia financially, whether you call it money or cash, whichever you prefer, but I understand that Europe would have started to collapse from the very moment they approved the expropriation of that money. And essentially, why is that? The first reason is probably because in that case, the Eurozone would basically collapse in the eyes of the whole world as a safe haven for money. China would have been alarmed, as would the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Brunei, and Kuwait. Everyone who keeps their money in Europe would have started to think twice. And that's reason number one. Yes, and it would have had consequences. Most likely, they would have started withdrawing their money and the euro would have begun to collapse. And reasonable politicians understood this. Plus, there's the burden of responsibility. And secondly, I think Russia would have delivered a symmetrical response. Since the Russians have already passed a whole series of laws that allow them to seize all European assets located in Russia without trial or investigation. But what's interesting, let me tell you something interesting now. As of today, 2,315 Western companies are still operating in Russia. No matter what they say about having left or not left, they haven't left. So, among them are Raiffeisen, one of the largest, and UniCredit from Italy. Working in collaboration, these entities collectively earned an impressive sum of approximately $19.5 billion during the previous fiscal year. What's interesting is that these funds are physically in Russia. They can't take them out, but they have them and can't withdraw them. Russians essentially are preparing to export their own money. And right now on their books, let me find this number if I'm not mistaken. Russians have about 130 billion euros on their books if these funds, these assets cannot be confiscated in just one day, one single day. Europe can't afford to do that, and it's important to understand this. Europe is divided, there are a lot of different opinions there, and that's why objectively Europe's hands are tied. And the key point is it's actually good that they didn't do this because, as I mentioned earlier, it would have sent a signal to the whole world that sovereign and private assets in Europe are no longer untouchable. And that's what I was most afraid of, because nothing like this ever happened even during the Cold War. Not even when troops entered Afghanistan or when the passenger Boeing was shot down over Sakhalin. No one ever did anything like that. Even during World War II, there were no such incidents. So yes, they allocated 90 billion as a loan for 2 years. Will they actually give it to us? They will. Okay. Will it be enough for us? Let's hope it will be enough. We're not diving into macroeconomics, but fortunately, the coalition of our friends and colleagues at least decided to allocate it in this way. We'll see what happens next. Let's move on. And the second point I'd like to discuss. This week, Putin said something very interesting. We'll either find the clip and insert it somewhere, with a translation. But basically what was said, so as not to strain your psyche with an extra dose of this inadequate nonsense. So what was said was basically this, that we are fighting in Ukraine using a surgical method.
С Украиной мы там действуем хирургическим способом, аккуратненько, так, чтобы, понятно, да? Это не война в прямом современном смысле этого слова. Если Европа вдруг захочет начать с нами войну,
like we're being very careful, but Europe will blow to smithereens. But in Ukraine, the implication is maybe, that we're brother Slavs. I mean, I don't get it. I don't know what he meant. But what was literally said was, we are fighting carefully, using surgical methods. So, in my view, Vladimir Putin has essentially revived a long-dead narrative that Russia isn't fighting in Ukraine at full capacity. If we really wanted to, we would have wiped everything here to hell and back. But now, you see, we're conducting a surgical special operation. So, remember in the first months of the war how everyone was told that civilians wouldn't be harmed? And if they were, it would only be the fault of the Ukrainians themselves. They explained that no one was touching the civilian population, that no one was bombing or executing people. But if that were true, I wouldn't be sitting here right now in our wonderful new studio telling you all about what's going on. Of course, talking about this seriously now is, well, foolish at the very least. But there are some things I'd like to bring up very quickly, actually. If there's interest, I can make a whole video on this topic, but I'll just go over it very quickly now. So, what's the comparison? They say that if we, like the Americans in Iraq, had just carpet bombed the hell out of all of Ukraine, I don't know how they'll translate the word obliterated. Well, it'll be something. If we had carpet bombed it, then that would have been it. Game over. But in Ukraine, the losses are supposedly minimal. And everywhere, Russians refer to the fact that, see, we're not like the Americans. And look, I'm no advocate for the Americans, I'll tell you that. And the whole world has questions about that war, not Desert Storm, but the one they called, what was it? Iraqi freedom. And we're not going to get into that, but it's a good opportunity to talk once again about how this war is actually being waged and whether it can really be claimed that it's somehow surgical. Look, let's deal with this popular argument I just mentioned. Right off the bat, I'm going to find the numbers now. First, let's just take a look. See, here's a shot of conquered Baghdad. And here are our cities. Avdiivka, Mariupol, what else? Marinka, whatever we can find. This is for comparison, to make it clear who is fighting and how. I'll say one thing. Perhaps the Russians could have carpet bombed Ukraine, as they say, but only in the case of nuclear bombings. Not just to the whole world, but even with all the power of their propaganda. They couldn't have sold it to their own audience. The idea of wiping out cities with nuclear bombings? Let's say they did. But you have to understand that a nuclear bombing doesn't give you a 100% victory. They would have faced a fierce partisan war and other such problems. Anyway, that's not the point. That's for another video. If you're interested, I'll film one. I'll use the language of numbers. So we can settle this important question, let's consider the facts. In order to defeat Iraq, which had a population of about 20 million people at the time, the Americans brought a massive force of 500,000 soldiers all the way to the other side of the world. They also deployed nearly 2,000 combat aircraft, and they used almost 14,000 precision munitions, such as Tomahawk missiles. During that military operation in Iraq, it is estimated that about 13,000 Iraqi people were killed, and a third of them were civilians. Those are heavy losses. But according to the most recent preliminary data available, in the battle for Mariupol alone, more civilians were tragically killed. And the footage, as well as the various reports from this war, truly speak for themselves.